Okay, good evening. The April 28th, 2022 special meeting is called to order. Would the secretary please take roll?
Yes, Commissioner Sultan.
Here.
Commissioner Phyllis.
Here.
Commissioner Teroses.
Here.
Commissioner Foster, Vice Chair Foster.
Here. I'm getting a message from a constituent that's watching that they can't see or hear us on City TV. Do you know if we're on?
I believe, yes, we are. City TV is in attendance and the live stream should be working. If the link that you're using is not working, please try YouTube or the Blue Jeans option. And Chair Duran.
I am here.
Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, moving on to the approval of the minutes for April 14th. May I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
All right, the first, the second?
Second.
Anyone? All right, Commissioner Teroses seconded. May we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Phyllis.
Abstain, as not present for the entire meeting last week or 2 weeks ago.
Commissioner Teroses.
Yes.
Commissioner Sultan.
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster.
Yes.
And Chair Duran.
I will abstain as well, as I was not present.
Motion carries.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Moving on to special agenda items. Are there any special agenda items to be discussed?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. I have a couple of items this evening. First of all, I wanted to announce that our spring newsletter will be in the mail to all tenants in rent-controlled units and property owners the week of May 9th. For the tenants, that report or the newsletter will include a report of their current maximum allowable rent as registered with the board, and the owners will receive that information in June when we do our summer mailing. The newsletter will announce the launch of the public-facing portion of the rent database, Civics. So we're excited to announce that and encouraging both property owners and tenants to register for accounts with us on Civics, and also to further educate people about Civics. We will be holding both a Landlord Seminar and a Tenant Seminar. The Landlord Seminar will be on Tuesday, May 17th from 10 to noon, and the Tenant Seminar will be on Thursday, May 19th from 10 to noon. And in both of the seminars, we will talk about, the provisions within the rent control law, the services available through our office, and demonstrate and present the new portal, Civics. So that's and they'll both be by video conference. And in the newsletter, there will be a QR code to facilitate signing up, or people who would like to sign up can call our office at 310-458-8751. And that's what I have this evening.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Any comments by any commissioners as to any of those? Seeing none? All right. Moving on to public comment. This is the time when people from the community could comment on matters that are within the jurisdiction of the board. I understand that there's been no request to speak under this agenda item. Is that still the case, Secretary Ho?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll close the public comment section and we will move on to public hearings, item number 11. This is the public hearing to consider whether to recommend to the City Council that the city place on the November 2022 ballot certain amendments to the city charter and the rent control amendment. And I'll read them so the record is clear. Number 1, whether the board should recommend that the city of Santa Monica adopt an amendment to the city charter requiring the registration of all non-rent controlled rental units. Number 2, whether the board should recommend that section 1806 sub A8(4) of the rent control charter amendment be amended to require that an owner intend to occupy the unit for at least 3 years instead of 1 year. Number 3, whether the board should recommend that section 1806 sub A8B or 5, of the rent control charter be amended to require an owner to reoffer the unit to the displaced tenant if the owner fails to reside in the unit for at least 3 years, and to allow an owner 60 days instead of 30 days to take occupancy of the unit. Number 4, whether the board should recommend that section 1803E of the RCCA be amended to allow commissioners to be elected to a maximum of 3 full terms to align with city elected officials. And number 5, whether the board should recommend that section 1803D of the charter be amended to state that an election need not be held if the number of qualified candidates does not exceed the number of open board positions. We'll begin with a staff report. I know we're all pretty familiar with this, but just to bring everybody up to speed, is there a staff report summarizing the issue?
Yes, good evening, commissioners. I will proceed with the staff report for this evening. This item is for continued public hearing for the board to consider whether to recommend to the city council that the city place proposed amendments to the city charter on the ballot for this November's general municipal election. As a point of clarity, the board does not have the authority to place items on the ballot directly, but it can make recommendations to city council that it do so. This item is therefore about whether to make that recommendation. City council would then review the matter and make the ultimate decision about whether to place this matter on the ballot, and if so, what specific language to use. There are 3 general subjects of proposed amendments that are to be considered this evening. The first is whether the city charter should be amended to require registration of all non-rent controlled rental units with the exception of single-family homes. The registration process envisioned by the proposed charter amendments would be incorporated into city processes outside of the administration of the rent control law, unless the city decided to contract with the rent control agency to administer that process, which it could do. The registration information would aid the city in understanding the full scope of the housing crisis in Santa Monica and determining more effective ways to mitigate the impact of that crisis. The second subject is whether the city charter's good faith requirements for the owner occupancy evictions should be amended to increase the timing of the owner's move-in from within 30 days to within 60 days, and increase the requirement of the owner's intended occupancy of the unit from at least 1 year to at least 3 years. The increase in the owner's move-in period reflects a reasonable time for an owner to make potential improvements or alterations to the unit prior to moving in, and the increase in the owner's intended occupancy period is designed to ensure that the eviction is not used as a pretext for the owner to rent the unit to a new tenant paying market rents. The third subject is whether the charter should be amended regarding the administration of elections. The board will consider whether to recommend amending the charter to extend term limits for rent control board commissioners so that they align with the term limits of city council members and permit commissioners to serve for 3 full terms instead of the current 2. Also, to improve election efficiency and conserve costs, the board will consider recommending an amendment to provide that no election is necessary when the number of qualified candidates does not exceed the number of open positions. The staff reports for this item propose language for the registry requirement. that would include disclosure of the occupancy status and commencement of the tenancy, dates of commencement of the tenancy, the rental amount, the reason the prior tenant vacated, the metering status of the unit, any housing services and amenities associated with the unit, and any changes in ownership information. The City of Santa Monica already collects this type of information in a variety of circumstances. For rent-controlled units, we collect that information with the registration forms. We also collect information of this nature in the context of Ellis withdrawals, petitions for rent increases, or determinations of tenants not in occupancy. And for all kinds of housing, the city also collects this type of information in things such as building permit applications, business licenses, occupancy permit applications, etc. Much of that information is also made public by landlords in a variety of other circumstances, such as when they advertise the units for rent, in the process of managing those units, arranging for maintenance, etc. That kind of information has also been required in other jurisdictions for registration, and the requirement for such disclosures has been upheld against legal challenges asserted on privacy grounds. In challenges brought against San Francisco, San Jose, Beverly Hills, and Los Angeles, courts have found that landlords do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in information of this nature because it is already routinely provided to the government and made public by landlords in many other circumstances. To cover the reasonable expenses necessary to administer the registration of non-rent controlled rental units, the proposed amendments include the ability of the city to establish an annual per unit fee that would be charged to property owners. The fee proposed is designed solely to reimburse the city for reasonable expenses related to the administration of the new registration requirements. The language proposed by staff regarding the fee does provide for a pass-through of 50% of the fee to tenants of registered units. Since the last meeting, staff has also confirmed that in addition to Culver City, West Hollywood also passed an ordinance requiring registration of non-rent controlled units, which will go into effect in January 2023. It requires similar registration information that is already collected for rent-controlled units. Additional details about the proposed language for the potential charter amendments are contained in the staff reports for this item. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we open this for public comment, I just want to make one brief announcement, which I failed to do earlier. If anybody in the public would like to call in to speak on this matter, I'm going to give you the phone number and the meeting ID information now. The phone number is area code 408-740-7256. The meeting ID is 183-969-339, and the passcode is 4766. Okay, so if anyone wants to speak who isn't already on the list, you can use those numbers to make a request. Moving on to...
I'm sorry, Chair Duran. The meeting ID is actually 976-406-515, and the passcode is 3310.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that correction. I appreciate it, Secretary Ho. All right, so I have 5 requests to speak. I will call the names in the order that we've received them. I'll list them all now so you can kind of get lined up as you're listening. The first one is Bill Davids, then Phyllis Dudick, Elizabeth Lair, Mike Soloff, and Denny Zane. They each have requested 3 minutes to speak. So the first one up is Bill Davids. And Secretary Ho, if you can assist with preparing the speaker to make his presentation.
Yes. Mr. Davids, you will have 3 minutes to speak. You have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that you were not supportive of items that I discussed in a previous meeting session concerning creating a mechanism to work with the City Council and put it in front of the voters to control increases that other municipalities like Culver City and like West Hollywood and Beverly Hills and the City of LA do to dampen or tamp down the increases, the general adjustments that tenants are going to sustain. We already know that the increase, the forthcoming increase, comes September 1st is 6%, and that is in concrete based upon the Santa Monica Rent Control Charter. However, going forward, because we're going to be faced quite possibly with another year or two of outstanding inflation, tenants need to be protected. I realize that property owners have expenses that have become inflationary as well, but basically what tenants are going to be faced with could lead to the displacement of tenants. I'm not trying to be overly dramatic and indicate that tenants are going to become homeless, but they might be displaced, especially long-term tenants, especially seniors, might be displaced by highly inflationary general adjustments. Insofar as mechanisms to alleviate the condition of inflationary or adjustments in inflationary times or in troubled economic times, there has to be a mechanism going forward, an anticipatory mechanism going forward to protect tenants. I realize that, again, property owners have expenses as well that have gone up, but tenants right now.
I'm sorry, Mr. Davids.
Yes.
I just want to make sure that the item that we're talking about here is consideration as to whether to recommend the City Council place on the November 22 ballot certain amendments that we've been discussing and
yes.
as agendized for this meeting. I understand your concern with the general adjustment, but and other commissioners, I see your hands up. I don't know that we have agendized what you're discussing about, or that it's part of this particular conversation.
Well, as part of this particular conversation, I'm sorry for interrupting, come September 1st, October 1st, and November 1st, leading into the November election, tenants are going to be writing much higher rent checks to their property owners. And
okay, hang on, Mr. Davids, hang on one second.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that we're on point with what we're supposed to be discussing this evening. I see Commissioner Phyllis's hand up. Commissioner Phyllis, if you'd like to interject.
Mr. Davids, are you aware that the Santa Monica Rent Control Board has not yet taken up the adjustment for next year, or whether it will impose a cap?
Mr. Davids, you've been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Well, the information that has been floating around right now indicates that, number one, the increase would be 25% less than the 8% inflationary rate in the Los Angeles area. So
that's incorrect. Mr. Davids, that's
yes.
incorrect. The board has to vote on it, and the board has the option to impose a cap. The board has not done that. We typically do so in June. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I think you may want to wait until that meeting.
Right. And I would add, Mr. Davids, that, we're really talking about something different tonight. This is about consideration whether to recommend to the City Council that the city place on the November 22 ballot certain amendments, which I discussed or labeled earlier. So if you could focus your comments, if you have any, with regard to what the agendized item is, I'll give you time to do that.
Basically, I wanted to supplement the agendized items with the consideration or the reconsideration of a mechanism to control basically the general adjustments that are passed along. Essentially, and this is important because it was just discussed, the Rent Control Board has aligned itself on another issue with municipalities like West Hollywood and Culver City, but at least at the previous meeting, it did not want to align itself with policies or mechanisms in place with the very same municipalities. And I would like to see equity if one set of circumstances is appropriate for the city of Santa Monica. I would hope that another set of circumstances involving general adjustments would be appropriate as well. So
all right.
Mr.
David, I'm giving you a lot of leeway here, but again, the subject matter regarding the general adjustment is not part of the discussion that we are having at this time. During the public comment, section 7, that might have been more an area where you could have raised that because that would have been under our jurisdiction. But right now, we are specifically speaking about consideration to amendments to the charter that we're trying to see whether we should submit these to the city council for this coming election. I saw Vice Chairperson Foster's hand up. Do you have any want to add in?
I have clarification I think can clear this up. Two things.
Okay.
One, what Mr. Davids is referring to is not the discretionary cap that we vote on as a board. What he's referring to is the emergency clause in our charter that's only been used one other time, which is 1990, when inflation has ever been this high. And it's a 6% emergency inflation cap that automatically replaces a higher GA with a new GA of 6%. That's what he's referring to. He's not referring to the discretionary cap that we would then place under that, which it will be engaged. That 6% emergency cap will be engaged. So that's the one he's referring to. Number two, I agree with Chair Duran. We can't take this up or discuss this right now. It is something that we could discuss after we discuss, there could be direction from board members at a later time for a future meeting. But I agree with Chair Duran. I think we should move on to the next speaker.
All right.
I just want to make a point of personal privilege. I just want to make very clear that it is premature to assume that we will be imposing any cap, particularly, or premature to be assuming that we'll be taking anything up or take an affirmative position on it, or the board has acted, and the reserving all rights that the cap may be significantly less than a 6% increase. So I want to make clear that the board is not taking any action on it, has not taken any action on it, unless anyone disagrees. Have we taken action on it that I'm not aware of? Okay.
No. Commissioner Trosis, did you have your hand up, or did you want to say anything?
No.
No? Okay. All right. Then, Mr. Davids, if you don't have anything specifically related to the item that is agendized, I'll give you the opportunity to speak. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the next speaker.
Mr. Davids, you've been unmuted. Please go ahead.
I appreciate the time. I appreciate the time and the clarification, and I will hold my thoughts for a future meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Davids. Next, we have Phyllis Dudick, who's requested 3 minutes to speak. Secretary Ho, if you could assist with preparation.
Yes. Before we get to Ms. Dudick, we did have a request to have the meeting ID and telephone number repeated. So once again, that is area code 408-740-7256. Meeting ID 976-406-515. Passcode 3310. Ms. Dudick, you have 3 minutes to speak. You have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Do I tell you my phone number out loud?
No.
What?
You don't. No, you do not have to do that. But you're free to speak to the board now. Your name has been
Oh,
called.
okay. Thank you very much.
You have
Okay.
3 minutes. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello. Good evening. I'm afraid that I'm probably not going to say too much either because, hello?
We can
Go
hear
ahead.
you.
Well, I'm going to, okay, I can't. Can you hear me? Because
Yes.
hello?
Ms.
Yes,
Dudek,
we can
you
hear
need to turn down whatever you're listening to us on, you need to turn that down because there's a delay.
This is really weird with this phone. Anyway, okay, fine. I'm wondering how, you see, I'm concerned about the same issue Mr. David is concerned about.
Okay. So as I mentioned with Mr. Davids, that's not the item that we're discussing currently.
Turn down, okay, turn down, okay, hold it.
Sure.
Whoa, this is really something else. Okay,
Can you hear me, Ms. Dudek?
I'm going to try to turn down my sound.
Okay. But can you hear me?
In a sense, it is the item. It's a question. Okay. I would like to know why, since rent increases is the bottom line for renters, I would like to know why the board did not consider a discussion. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead. You have 3 minutes to speak. So if you want to use it.
Oh my God, this is so confusing. I'm hearing things from all angles. Okay, I would like to know why it is that the board did not consider adding the question Mr. Davids brought up to the package you're presenting, so that there could possibly be some mitigation in the future, because this ties the hands of the council, it ties the hands of the board, and could potentially jeopardize security. In the future, yeah.
Oh,
hearing myself,
okay.
I don't know.
Okay, Commissioner Phyllis, go ahead.
Yes.
Hi, Miss Dudek. Are you aware, and I also asked Mr. Davids this question, are you aware that the Rent Control Board has not yet voted on what the adjustment will be for next year? So this discussion is this may be premature. Because there is an additional mechanism beyond the 75% CPI that's already written into our charter that allows us to impose a dollar amount cap that will likely be less than 6% inflation. I believe last year it was around $40. Are you aware of that?
Ms. Dudek, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead. Ms. Dudek, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Rents over $2,400.
Well, we know.
I couldn't hear Ms. Dudek's response over Anastasia.
Ms. Dudek, go ahead.
Well, my understanding it's 6%, not to go over a certain amount.
I believe you're misunderstanding, and this is probably something that an analyst can talk with you about after the meeting.
Okay, fine.
But I think that there may be some additional information that may clarify this process for you that an analyst can provide you with.
Having heard that, Ms. Dudek, do you have any comments you'd like to make with regard to the item that's listed as the agendized public hearing for tonight's meeting?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Commissioner Sultan, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, the last two speakers are basically proposing another amendment to the charter which would permit us not to raise, not to impose the general adjustment, which is, you know, in other rent control jurisdictions, like in LA, you know, rents have been frozen during the pandemic. They're still frozen. They're going to be frozen for like a year. And for people who are very low income, perhaps living on Social Security disability, you know, even a minimal increase, you know, 25, 50, you know, can push them, you know, their cushion is just so limited. So, you know, I think that may be what's being proposed or gestured towards.
Okay, Commissioner, go ahead, Ms. Sherman.
Thank you. I just want to interject, sorry to interrupt the conversation, but I just want to interject to remind you that as some of the commissioners have stated, the issues around the general adjustment or even a charter amendment regarding general adjustment and how the general adjustment might be calculated has not been noticed for this meeting. Although we're discussing charter amendments, there's a very specific set of amendments that have been proposed, and so anything outside of those proposed amendments is really not proper for discussion at this time, although, as you know, you can certainly direct staff to place it on a future meeting agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman. That was my understanding. That's where I was trying to go with this as well. Commissioner Phyllis, go ahead.
Yeah, I thank you, Ms. Sherman, for that reminder, because I was about to say the same thing, that the Brown Act really limits what we can talk about today. But I do appreciate that we had two speakers specifically raise this point. It seems appropriate and timely given inflation. And so if there's interest among the other commissioners, I'd be inclined to at least set it up as a discussion item for our May meeting. It's only, you know, a week and a half away. We still have time, and it sounds like there's a strong interest from our community. Is there anyone else who would be supportive of putting that on as a discussion item?
I would.
Right, shouldn't we get through the public comment and the other item first, and then we could do that at the end? I believe there's a spot in the agenda for that at the end of the agendized items.
Actually, you can request a discussion item at any time.
Okay.
Yeah, so then let's just clear that up, and then we'll move forward with the other speakers. So I believe that there's been a request to make it a discussion item, and I thought I heard a second.
I believe Commissioner Sultan.
By Commissioner Sultan, thank you. Can we have a roll call vote on that real quick, and then we'll go back to this discussion?
Yes, Commissioner Terosis.
Sorry, just to clarify, we're voting on whether we want to place this on a future item for a public hearing. Yes.
Commissioner Sultan.
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis.
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster.
Yes.
And Chair Duran.
Yes, and thank you all for your patience and indulgence in doing this way. We'll go back. I have another speaker on the item. The name is Elizabeth Layer. Secretary Ho, if you can assist with getting that started, she's requested 3 minutes to speak.
Yes, Ms. Layer, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, good evening. And I want to say that I would have hoped this new discussion item would have been discussed before we got these increases, that there would have been a way to handle this. The people that I have spoken to, every single one of them, when I told them how much it's going to go up, and by the way, I was told that it will be 139 or no cap. So we'll see. We'll see next meeting. But that's what I was told by the rent control office by
now,
3 people.
Ms. Layer, are you referring to the general? Ms. Layer, are you referring to the general adjustment, or are you referring to the items that has been agendized?
Well, they're related. They work together. So this year we're probably screwed, and there's going to be a lot of people not aware now, And when they are made aware, and I would hope they'd be made aware sooner rather than later, because people need to budget. This is huge increase. So, I would hope that my elected officials and city staff would help to spread this word so people will be able to prepare for this. So, and also do anything and everything you can to address this so for next year or the year after that. So that's, I think it's the best way is to be prepared for. This was an extreme situation that we've had with this inflation and the pandemic. And I do know people that are really, it's going to be a real hardship. So I want to thank you for letting us speak about this. And there is definitely support to do something. And there will be more support when people find out how much their rents are going to go up. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lair. And as I'm sure you're aware, we've added a discussion item for the next board meeting. And if people want to speak on this subject, that would be the time to do so in full. Commissioner Phyllis, your hand is up. Go ahead.
I have a question, I guess, for staff, which is it true that we've been informing people what the general adjustment will be before the board has been informed of it, or before the board has even been advised about, this potential 6% measure? Because I definitely don't know about it, and I think it's extremely inappropriate to hear about it from constituents right now.
Go ahead. Connie, go ahead.
So when the board proposed the changes to the charter that were Measure GA that went before the voters in 2012, it included very specific language about how the general adjustment is calculated and how a potential ceiling is calculated. So it is proscribed by the language of the charter right now. Based upon the March to March change in the Consumer Price Index, which was 8.5%, 75% of that would be 6.375, but the charter imposes a maximum increase of 6%. So just by looking at the charter language, you can see what this year's general adjustment will be. It is specified in the charter. The ceiling is also prescribed by the charter. There's a very set way that we do it, and we will announce that to we will provide a staff report for that and announce it at the May 12th meeting, as we always do. So that will be given to the board in a week. It will be publicly available a week from tonight. And so the charter is very specific about it. So no, we have not been informing people. It's just that people are looking at the charter to see what the maximum will be. We have not yet announced what the potential ceiling will be, but that will be announced in a week.
Okay, I'm concerned because there at least seems to have been some public comment that says that they talked to people on the rent control board or analysts with the rent control. That was what I heard from public testimony, that someone had talked to someone at the rent control board. They had talked to staff and they said this is what it would be. I'm happy to hear it seems like that's not what happened. Maybe I misheard. But I think there was a lot of concern about this without a whole lot of clarification, particularly around the safety valve that is the cap. And I want folks to know that we still have that, and we do not know what that number will be. I don't know what that number will be. I am waiting until our May meeting to find out what that number will be. But that is something that we always take up under every charter, under the charter amendment that is Measure GA. So I was slightly concerned by some of the public comment, but I'll do additional, I'll try to get a better understanding of that after the meeting.
Okay, thank you. Moving on then to the next speaker, we have Michael Soloff. He's requested 3 minutes to speak. Secretary Ho, if you can assist with preparing that.
Yes, actually, Mr. Soloff has dropped off. Mr. Soloff, if you would like to return to speak, please redial the number that was provided to you by email. We do have Danny Zane up next to speak. Mr.
Okay.
Zane,
Go ahead.
you've been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. So can the board hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Denny Zane. I'm co-chair of Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. I want to express my common concern with those tenants who spoke to you just recently, and I look forward to having this discussion in a couple of weeks. As to the item that is on your agenda very narrowly tonight, 5 rather suggested amendments to the charter. I think these are all well taken and should be requested of the City Council to place them before voters. A couple of them, for example, changing term limits to be consistent with the city, or not having an election if there are only sufficient candidates for open seats. Those seem to me like very simple, like good government kinds of reforms that you ought to move forward. The suggestion that owner occupancy intent for 3 years be a requirement for owner occupancy evictions is in order to avoid sham evictions. I think is very well taken, and is the second piece of that to provide a displaced tenant the opportunity to move back in if the property owner in fact does not stay 3 years. Those are all, I think, excellent suggestions. As to the registration of non-rent controlled units, I'm very happy to hear that you've expressly excluded single-family homes from that discussion. There really are 2 categories, I think, of units that would be affected here. One is units with already owner occupancy exemptions, and I think we do want to have this kind of registration for that class of units because we really do, I think, need to know how such an exemption manifests itself in the marketplace and in the real world. And we should not be, I think, just naively expecting that everything works out for the best. There may need to be reforms considered there as well. And the other category is units built after 1979, non-rent controlled units. Registration, I think there's a number of different reasons why this is very important. To establish database lines to understand market conditions for non-controlled rental units. What is the impact of development policies in the city and quantities of market rate development on the rents of non-rent controlled units? For example, does it increase supply actually bring market rents down, or does it gentrify and drive market rate rents up? You can only discover that if you have the data for the non-controlled units. It's also pertinent for establishing the rent levels for gauging viability, the viable inclusionary housing policies. The higher the rent levels in the marketplace for market rate development, the more viable higher inclusionary policies are. It's also pertinent to understand where there are gaps in the rental market, perhaps populations with unmet needs that the city might want to address. We also want to ensure that lawful rental units are not being used for unlawful purposes, such as short-term rentals, Airbnb, and so on and so forth. We need to gauge the effectiveness of those laws to protect our rental housing stock. After all, those units were permitted and for development to be part of our housing stock, not part of our visitor stock. We also want to gauge, I think, the effectiveness of our just cause eviction provisions that apply to these units. And we want to understand our actual vacancy rates. And I think finally, it's important to be able to verify revenue for business license taxation purposes on such units. So there are a number of, I think, compelling reasons why this is an important reform to include on the charter. And I urge you to move forward and we'll take any questions. And I will testify to the council to that effect.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Zane. Any questions for Mr. Zane? Seeing none. Thank you for your time, Mr. Zane. Appreciate your comments. Secretary Ho, has Mr. Soloff gotten back on?
Yes, Mr. Soloff, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Try from my cell phone, which is up.
There you go.
So I'm trying from my cell phone. Hopefully you can hear me. It's been dropping off occasionally. But in any event, you've already heard from Denny Zane, my co-chair at Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. I think has made pretty clear the reasons why the proposals for charter amendments make good sense. I will just add that in addition to serving in the capacity of a co-chair of SMER, I have also, in my pro bono legal practice, litigated tenants' rights cases and served 7.5 years on the Santa Monica Housing Commission, dealing with issues related to preserving affordable housing in the city. And while the rent control stock of the city is, of course, an absolutely crucial aspect of our housing policy, there is no way to actually do intelligent, data-driven policy in the city on housing unless we understand the entire market. And while one can go to your annual reports and get great data on rent levels, trends, etc., we just don't have that available in a convenient and usable fashion for policymakers in the city. And that would be solved by the proposal that you're making for a rent registry. And as Mr. Zane indicated, that would be important to actually deal with, for example, value enhancement analyses that go into our affordable housing production program requirements for market rate development. There are estimates put in by folks, but consultants that the city pays money to, but there would be no substitute for having the actual information about what rents are being charged. There's a lot of discussion about what the impact of various types of development are on the market, on the rent rates in the city. But again, we don't actually have that data in any real accessible way, and we would have that now. We don't know what the vacancy rate is, because after all, building units or having units doesn't do anything unless there are people living in them, and that's an absolutely critical piece of information for the city. Whether or not people are complying with our ordinance that's been put in place to assure that units are being used not as either hotel rooms or extended stay hotels or the like, but are actually serving members of our community, understanding whether the nature of what happens with people in these various market rate units. Are they people who are really in the community, or are they people who are just floating in and out over time? And if that is what's happening, what can we do about it? So there are many, many reasons for that. On the owner occupancy piece, obviously it's crucial. And I'd like to believe, and I hope that it's true, and I think it probably is true, that most landlords would not abuse the law in any way. But unfortunately, in experience, there are people who do that, and it's important to have a mechanism in place that protects our irreplaceable rent control stock, since the state has made it impossible to create any new rent control stock. And finally, it seems to make sense to align the term limits and the election procedures for the rent control board with that of city council. I've never understood why there was some special rule for the rent control board that was different from the council. I felt that way in terms of that the council needed term limits when they had none, and now it seems like they ought to be aligned. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Sola. Appreciate your comments. Mr. Ho, have there been any more requests to speak on this item?
Yes, we do have Ariel Pepper on the line. Ms. Pepper, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you so much. Sorry, I wanted to say that I thank you so much for the commissioner for listening to the earlier public comment and introducing the new discussion item. I appreciate that. And I would like to say that I believe that it would be prudent to move forward with all of the items, specifically 1 through 4. I really appreciate. I learned a little bit about 5 today. I didn't know much about the election element, and I'm thankful that you guys added that. The element of expanding it from 1 year to 3 years will definitely help a lot of people, especially since I think people have found ways to, just during the market, it will help a lot of tenants feel more secure to know that there isn't I would hate to use the term, but the sham evictions that sometimes happen. Thank you so much for taking all of these items, and I hope to see them in front of City Council for future elections. That's it.
Are there any more requests to speak, Secretary Ho?
No, there are no more.
Okay. Then this will conclude the public comment section. The board will now begin its deliberation. Are there any requests to speak by commissioners? Go ahead, Vice Chair Foster.
Sure, thank you. Wow, I really enjoyed all the public comments that came in. I think since this is the 4th meeting we're having about these items, I think the first 4 are pretty clear. However, I wanted to bring to my fellow colleagues' attention, there's some back feedback. Are you guys hearing feedback? I don't
You're spotty. You're spotty.
Not anymore. I feel like it went away.
Okay. When I was preparing my remarks to support the new database that includes non-rent controlled units, I came across something. And now that we're bringing back something in 2 weeks anyway that we may or may not vote after a public hearing to add to the list of things we might send to City Council for this ballot measure, I wanted to bring your attention to something. We, as part of this new database registration, are requiring annual reporting of both rent amount that's being collected and the vacancy status. If any unit has been vacant for more than 30 days, it must be reported as part of this registration and annual recertification. It occurs to me that the 11,000 plus non-rent controlled units that are going to fall under this new database registration are going to be reporting vacancy data to us. However, because it's in a different location in the charter, the 27,000 rent controlled units will still not be reporting any vacancy data to us. So like our caller said, I believe if we need the full discussion and full picture of the housing market in our city, both for purposes of dealing with future trends in rent control, in speculation, in tenant protections or harassment, in needs of stakeholders or landlords, and in vacancy rate questions, which are discussed all the time, it seems like it would make sense to add to the charter a small addition to our section in the charter that already exists, and add that we want vacancies reported after 30 days as well. That way, the data will be balanced between rent-controlled apartments and non-rent controlled. And the reason, I checked with staff, the reason this fell through the cracks is because we are already, Ford, I'm speaking right now. we are already collecting all these things we're talking about asking for in the new database. We're already collecting housing services, amenities. We're already collecting, and we don't need to recertify for rent-controlled units because we know what they are, because it's the general adjustment. So all these things we're asking of the new units, there's one thing we're missing for the rent-controlled units, and that is the notice of vacancy. And so I would like to propose to all of you and hear your thoughts on adding that one caveat. Staff said it would just simply be a 5th item that goes to council, and council can decide and stakeholders can talk. We can add it to a public hearing in 2 weeks. Council can hear it if we all decide to send it, and speakers can talk about it there, staff can talk about it there, and then again, of course, public can discuss it in preparation for the election. So I'd like to hear what you guys think about that.
I'm happy to go. Okay, Steve's on mute, but that's okay.
You're muted, Steve.
Yeah, that's okay.
Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner Trosses, and then Commissioner Phillips.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Commissioner Foster, I think that's a good idea. I think the transparency well, I'll get to the reasons why I think the rent registry is needed, but transparency is one of them, right? And if we're really going to have transparency across all the units, then we need to make sure that our rent controlled units comport with the information we're asking for across the board. And yeah, I don't see anything. I'm happy to, do we need to do a motion for that to put on a public hearing?
Just like what Commissioner Phillips seconded by Commissioner Stolt, it'd be just like what we did earlier. So yeah, I would move that we direct staff to add a second item to the public hearing next year under the same umbrella of potentially adding it to the ballot measure, which would require noticing of vacancies of rent controlled units in line with what we're testing for the non-rent controlled.
Okay. There's a motion on that. Second by Commissioner Trosses. We can do a roll call vote on that.
Yes, Commissioner Sultan.
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis.
Yes.
Commissioner Trosses.
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster.
Yes.
And Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay.
Thanks. That's the extent of my comments. I am looking forward to doing some good work and hearing from people in the next couple of weeks. And I'm still supportive of all of these of the 4 original items.
Okay. Anyone else wish to speak? Commissioner Commissioner Phyllis, go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that I have everything directly up in front of me. So if you'll just indulge me for a minute as I'm making sure that I have all my documents in front of me. I am extremely supportive of 4 out of, I believe, 5 of these items. I'm trying to pull up the specific list right now.
Take your time.
Sorry. I just want to get it, make sure that I'm sorry. My computer is being challenging. Great. Here it is. Here's the final packet. We are still considering the extension of term limits in this package, correct? Okay. That is the item that I am concerned. So I have 2 concerns. One is relatively modest and has to do with the type of information we're collecting in the rent registry. I am not sure I'm comfortable with collecting information about why a unit was vacated. 1, because I think it'll be kind of hard to aggregate, and 2, I think it's pretty intrusive. So I'd be inclined to drop that just because I don't know that it's going to get us meaningful data, and I think it could create a vulnerability in the ballot measure.
I agree.
So that's my one kind of friendly amendment to that one. The one that gives me the most.
Commissioner Phillips, can I ask you a quick, just before you move on, can I ask you a quick question about that?
Sure.
As a discussion with you. I felt the same way you do about that, stating the reason for the vacancy. Do we think it could be that staff was using like a shorter speech for saying, was it an Ellis or was it a eviction or what? Do you think maybe that's what they were digging at? Something more categorical?
I mean, have you had conversations? I haven't had conversations with staff about it. So, I mean,
not about that detail, no.
It certainly doesn't appear to be. I mean, the text seems to be like the reason for vacature, right? So it's not
very vague.
Text.
Very vague. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's unhelpful. I think it creates a vulnerability. I wouldn't want to include it. you know, if it was like Ellis status or anything like that, one, we already collect it, so I don't know that we need to re-aggregate it, but I wouldn't have like a principled objection to collecting it in this way. The one that does give me pause is the extension of term limits, and it gives me pause for a couple reasons. First, I think that 2 term limits is enough for us to do good work on this board. I also think 2 term limits has the impact, this being a more representative body, a body where you don't have to be completely entrenched within existing power structures to serve your community in this way. The fact that there are I think appropriate, you know, current 2-term limits actually is the reason why I certainly ran, because there was a vacancy. And I'm concerned that extending it 3 terms, which is a 50% increase, will make this race less accessible for kind of average Santa Monicans to participate in city government. I think it'll make it more expensive and more competitive. And this is the part that most bothers me. It multiplies the power of incumbency, and I think that it's important in building public trust and inclusion and transparency that we are mindful of the fact that the power of incumbency is incredibly powerful. And I am concerned about the ability of more people to get involved in this role if we have very, very long-term, you know, 8 plus 10, you know, very long-term electeds in this position. I also want to note that it is not inconsistent with many other offices to have a 2-term limit. The governor has a 2-term limit, the lieutenant governor has a 2-term limit, state level offices have a 2-term limit, many regulatory agencies have a 2-term limit. And I think that makes good sense because the policy agenda, unlike city council or the state legislature, is much narrower. We don't have the power to pass laws on the rent control board. We enact regulations to affect the purpose of the charter amendment. And I think we've all been able to do that very, very effectively in the time that we've had on this board. And I think the potential increase in cost and the accessibility of this office to average folks who want to run and get involved is really, really concerning. I also don't really see a compelling reason to do this now. In 2018, Measure TL was passed. So that was 2 election cycles ago. There was a decision at that time not to amend the Rent Control Board's term limit. They decided not to. It was not included in that charter amendment. There was not a strong feeling that it should have been included in that I didn't see it in that amendment. And we didn't reach it again in 2020. And I also don't like the idea. I'm uncomfortable personally as an elected with using our power to extend our power. I'm uncomfortable with that. I'm uncomfortable with using our power to extend our own terms. And I understand that it's 1 term, but I want to see a very strong package that serves tenants get passed. And I think if we lump this in there, it gives everyone an opportunity to attack this as self-serving, as a power grab. And I think it creates, I think we have other things that we should prioritize more. So I'm open to hearing from my fellow commissioners. I have a strong expectation that I may be in the minority on this, and I'm okay with that. But I'm just deeply uncomfortable with using our power to extend our own term limits or to recommend an extension of our own term limits because I think we have more important things to do.
Commissioner Phyllis, any other points? Is that it?
I'm strongly in support of everything else, and I appreciate Commissioner Terosis and Commissioner Foster for all their work in bringing these forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak on the matter? All right. Go ahead, Commissioner Terosis.
Yeah, I also want to thank the members of the public. First of all, thanks, Commissioner Phyllis, for expressing your viewpoint. I think obviously it's no surprise that I brought these forward, so I'm probably going to have to disagree with you today. I think that as we've talked about, I think there is some value in institutional knowledge, and I don't think 3 terms is excessive in order to have some continuity of knowledge base and expertise on the board. And additionally, it brings us into parity with our counterparts across the city. I wanted to speak really briefly on the Steve. I assume we're talking about everything right now, so I'm just gonna go ahead and talk about everything. So first of all, thanks for everyone who came in and commented. If we don't have public discourse and people bring up issues like the ones we heard tonight, we don't get things done. So I know sometimes it's intimidating or burdensome to comment here, but thank you for coming. And know that I'm always happy to meet with folks outside of the meeting as well. But in terms of why I feel really, really strongly about the rental registry, I know I had some conversations with many of you who might not be in favor of this. I know there was some discussion that there was a rent registry bill at the state. That bill has now been pulled at the request of the author. So, I do think that we need to bring ourselves up to the standard of our counterparts in Berkeley and Culver City. County of LA is doing a countywide registry. We heard about West Hollywood. And more importantly, I think all the points that were raised already about the impact on our affordable housing stock, the impact of our development policies, the impact that rent control has on market rate development, I think those are all points that are very well taken, and similar reasons, why I was in favor of this in the first place. We really do need to increase our transparency so we can preserve our existing tenancies. I think I've talked to some of you about the power imbalance that I feel that there exists in all of my work that I've done between landlords and tenants. And I can't tell you how many tenants have come to me saying, my landlord told me I have 5 days to leave my apartment and I have to go, and what do I do? And had, they not received counseling, they would have left. And I think that this at least allows us to have some sort of oversight over who's, in units and, how much they're being rented for, and have some sort of oversight mechanism as well, so that there's transparency. And I think most importantly, we've heard rampant violations of both our short-term rental ordinance and our corporate rental ordinance. And I think that, again, we need to shine a flashlight onto what's going on in the city. And I think that this provides us the opportunity to ensure that we're best enforcing our current laws, that we have oversight over all of our rental units, and we're able to enforce those ordinances that we put in place. And I think that a registry, we've heard a lot too about code enforcement and habitability issues, et cetera. I think that, again, this provides greater transparency for all parties as to where they can go, that there is a registration with the city. And I think most importantly, just giving us more information to make database decisions about our housing stock, about what we do with funding coming in for housing, and what really the crisis is in our city specifically, because yes, we have aggregate data across the region, but really what's happening in our city, what is the makeup of our rental housing stock, and at what rate is it being rented. I too agree with Commissioner Phyllis. I think, reasons why a unit was vacated, let's say there's a domestic violence situation, et cetera, I just don't think it's appropriate or necessary for us to ask that question. So I do agree that we should remove that when we bring this forward to City Council. And I hope that this will help us, provide greater transparency across the city, and allow us to monitor our tenancies. So thanks. And again, I support all of the initiatives brought forth today to bring forward to the City Council.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Trosses. I would like to make a couple of comments. As to Commissioner Phil, okay, well, as to Commissioner Phyllis's point about the having 3 terms as opposed to 2 terms and our requesting that it be extended, I get your point. I understand your sentiments on that. But I think if we look at this, we pull back from the trees and we look at the forest, what we're doing tonight is number one, I don't know who else would recommend a change in the term limit other than the people who are doing the board work. And then you pull back and you look at the forest from the trees, and what happens with our vote today is we move something to the City Council, who's going to have their own deliberations, and they are going to decide whether they want any of these things, all of these things, some of these things to go on the ballot. And if whatever they decide, then it's going to go back to the general public, and the public's going to decide all of these things. So ultimately, it is going to end up in the hands of the public as to whether, the 1 year is going to be extended to 3 years, the registry is going to go or not, whether there's going to be 3 term limits or 2 term limits, and all of that. So I feel comfortable with making the proposal as stated for the 3 years, knowing that there's still a couple more at least versions that may come out before it gets to the public, and then ultimately the public's going to decide what they want to do. And so I think this is just democracy at work. What I would like to do when anybody is ready to make a motion, I'll entertain a motion. It seems like the conversation is rounded up, and of course, if anybody wants,
I just have a question for staff first before you do that, if I could, because it might affect. I'm not done discussing.
Okay, perfect. Then what I would like to propose when the time is ready is that, since there might be some votes that are different, that we take these one at a time. And the way I have them, where they're listed on the agenda, is I see 5 subparts, and I would like to just have us vote on each of the 5 separately, and then we'll just see what makes it to the City Council and what doesn't based on the votes. So whenever we're ready, that's what I would like to do. Commissioner Vice Chair Foster, you had a comment.
So I'm inclined to agree about the reason for vacancy. I just wanted to give staff an opportunity because nobody's stuck their hand up. I just wondered if staff had comment on that. If there's something we're missing or if the wording was too vague and you had some other intent, I just wanted to give staff a chance to answer that.
So when we discussed this, we somewhat modeled it off of what we require in terms of rent registration for controlled units. And initially, we did require reporting why a unit became vacant. Yes, the reason for the vacancy. That was provided for in the Costa-Hawkins law. So we were thinking, that we would provide that. But as you look at the language that was proposed, that is not one of the things that is required for a unit, one of these non-rent control units, to be properly registered. There are specific things that are stated, and why the unit became vacant is not one of them. So we were not putting that into the proposed language that would be in the charter. And we have found that in the rent-controlled units, 99% of the forms tell us that they are vacant because of a voluntary vacancy. So it was not specifically included in the language, but we will take it out if that's the board's preference. We will just take it out of the staff report that we will ultimately forward to the City Council.
I mean, do you feel like you want to replace it with like a checkbox list that's not invasive, or do you just want to take it out completely?
Well, what I've heard the commissioners say is that they would prefer to take it out. If they want some other option, let us know and we will address that.
I guess the only thing I would say is that, Tracy, is there an option to make sure that if there's a buyout, we know that information? Like, I think that would be pertinent to our tracking. And I don't know what other commissioners think.
They're required to file that anyway. They just don't. Sometimes. But I don't, yeah, Tracy, is that?
Well, under the city's law, they are required to, notify the board of buyout agreements and provide that information to us. We maintain that for the controlled units. So,
I mean, is it possible to say, like, was this vacancy the result of a buyout agreement, yes or no? I would be interested in that information. I don't need
I
to
would
hear
too. They have to affirmatively state it, and if they didn't give the sheet to a tenant, for example, the tenant could see that record. That'd be helpful.
So you can make that suggestion if you would like to the council, and if the council would like to do that, they could incorporate it into their procedures, because as you've been discussing, this would be an amendment to the city charter, Chapter 23 of the city charter, which deals with non-rent controlled units, not a change to Chapter 18 of the city charter, which is the rent control law.
So are you saying we would just suggest it to them through staff reports and through other, as more of an ancillary item? It's not actually part of the language we'd be sending in our proposal?
Right. You could say that, that you would like the idea that they might request information about whether a vacancy was the result of a buyout. We can add that when we forward it to the city council, if that's the board's, if the board agrees on that and would like us to forward that.
I like it.
I agree, and I would like you to forward it.
Okay, William, so do we need to have a vote by all 5 of us in order to do that? It seems like we do.
Or is that consensus?
I think it's just a direction to staff. In fact, I think the only thing that we're doing is, like, generally speaking, adopting each recommendation to send forward, right, Tracy?
Yes, but I mean, if you're going to have a motion for each of these items, you could include that in the motion so that it's very clear that the board as a whole, or at least a majority of the board, is supportive of that.
Okay. So can we just have a discussion about that one piece, whether or not to do, I guess, a friendly amendment to this first item with regard to having that, what was just being discussed? I'm sorry.
A checkbox for buyout offers.
Yes. So just talking about that, is there any opposition to that idea of adding that as a friendly to this first thing we're going to vote on? Seeing none. Ms. Condon, do we need to do or council, do we need to have a vote on whether we can add a friendly amendment to that with that checkbox idea added, as well as, we'll strike that, with that checkbox added?
I move, Steve, why don't we make this easier? I move that we endorse and submit to City Council the first recommendation for the November 2022 ballot, requesting that the city put on the ballot a charter amendment to require the registration of all not controlled rental units, explicitly exempting single-family homes, and clarifying that we would recommend that City Council track buyout information through an affirmative yes or no question. On the registration. Yeah. Okay. So we're going one with the amendment.
Yes. Well, one at a time. Okay. So there's been a first and a second. Any further discussion on that? Seeing none, I'll call a roll call vote.
Yes. Commissioner Torosis.
Yes.
Commissioner Sultan,
Didn't hear you.
We can't hear
You're
we can't
muted.
hear you.
Was that a yes, Commissioner Sultan? Or no? Yeah.
We can't hear you. Yeah. Sorry.
okay, that's a yes for Commissioner Sultan. Commissioner Phyllis,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion for the second one, which is whether the board should recommend Section 1806A sub A8(4) of the Rent Control Charter Amendment be amended to require that an owner and intended occupant occupy the unit for 3 years instead of 1 year.
I'm sorry. Are you looking for a motion or a second?
I'm looking for a motion.
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
Any second? All right. First and a second. Roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Sultan,
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis,
Yes.
Commissioner Roses,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
and Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, moving to number 3 on the agendized items. Now, whether the board should recommend that Section 1806 sub A8(5) of the Rent Control Charter Amendment be amended to require an owner to reoffer the unit to the displaced tenant if the owner fails to reside in the unit for at least 3 years, and to allow an owner 60 days instead of 30 days to take occupancy of the unit. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
So moved.
Okay, there's been a
Second.
first, and a first by Commissioner Phyllis, second by Commissioner Foster. Roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Phyllis,
Yes.
Commissioner Roses,
Yes.
Commissioner Sultan,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
and Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, number 4, whether the board should recommend that Section 1803E of the Rent Control Charter Amendment be amended to allow commissioners to be elected to a maximum of 3 full terms to align with city elected officials. Is there a
So moved.
motion? Okay, it's been a first by Chair Foster, Vice Chair Foster. Second, anyone?
I'll second that.
Okay, Commissioner Sultan, second. Roll call vote, please.
Yes, Commissioner Roses,
Yes.
Commissioner Sultan,
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis,
No.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
and Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, number 5, whether the board should recommend that Section 1803D of the Rent Control Charter Amendment be amended to state that an election need not be held if the number of qualified candidates does not exceed the number of open board positions. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Okay, it's been a first and a second by Commissioner Phyllis and I think Commissioner Trosis.
It was Foster, I think.
Okay, Commissioner Foster. Roll call vote, please.
Yes, Commissioner Sultan,
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis,
Yes.
Commissioner Roses,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
and Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Moving on to item 16. Before I leave that, I know it's been a lot of work, a lot of discussion, a lot of meetings on that subject. Thank you all for participating and really diving into the weeds to feel our way through this and get what we can to the city council. I think it's going to be a good, they'll have a lot to work with, so that's great. So moving on to number 16. Anybody motion for adjournment?
So moved.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Commissioner Phyllis first, and Commissioner Tarosis, I heard, is the second. Before we do a roll call vote, our next Rent Control Board meeting is May 12th, 2022 at 7 p.m. It is to be determined whether it will be via teleconference or in person in the council chambers. So, roll call vote, please.
Yes, Commissioner Sultan,
Yes.
Commissioner Phyllis,
Yes.
Commissioner Tarosis,
Yes.
Vice Chair Foster,
Yes.
and Chair Duran.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.